friends, and welcome back to the Rewind podcast of Forward Church. Join us each week as we take a look back on Sunday's message and dig a little deeper into the conversations with those who are teaching across our sites at Forward. We want to invite you to be part of the conversation too. So if something we're talking about on Sunday morning sparks a question in you, head to our website, forwardchurch.ca/ask us, and submit your questions there. And we're going to do our best to engage with those questions in this space. With that said, let's jump in and get started.
So welcome back to the COVID-19 quarantine edition of the Rewind podcast. Here with you today is Andrew Nunn. That's me, student ministry pastor here at Forward Church, and also your host. And then we have Steve Adams, who again was preaching here for us, but you got to do that a little bit differently yet again, Steve. Do you feel like you've found your groove at this point, or they just keep changing things too quickly on you?
No, I mean, it's fine. You have to adjust, and that's we're all having to adjust in many different ways. And so whether it's on the platform with a bunch of people looking at me or in my family room, it's all good.
So you did sort of week by week, the last 3 weeks, you did a couple that were empty auditorium situation, but this one you had just recorded with just our tech guy, Ben, in your living room. Have you ever done that before? Like a full sermon pre-recorded with nobody? Is that a new experience for you as well?
I've done a few of those, not a lot, but it's always different. You start to feel what it must be like to be a newscaster or somebody like that, where you just, you don't know whether people are with you or what's going on. So it's definitely a different feel for sure.
Was there anything that you feel like you have to do differently in that, when the medium changes like that you have to sort of adjust how you preach?
Well, I think people want to sense more that you're talking to them individually as opposed to them collectively. If they're sitting in an auditorium with 1,000 people, then they know that you're speaking to them as a group. But when you're speaking just to them in their living room, maybe a family or an individual, a couple, I think there is a different sense that, it's more of a speaking to them in more the singular sense. And so, I try and adjust a little bit in that regard.
Yeah, I thought you and the whole production team there did a really good job of having like that intimate, like hanging out in a living room, chatting together. I thought you guys captured that really well in terms of how you manage the medium as well as the message. Before we dig into your message for this week, what is the most fun and interesting way you are managing your time here in the quarantine days of not being able to interact with other people?
Well, I'm a bit of a book junkie, and so I've got lots of books that I'm perusing and reading and spending time thinking, a little bit of writing. And so, I spend a lot of time study. I spend a lot of time interacting, talking to other pastors, either by phone or online, just trying to encourage other churches that I've been working with in my other ministry, my consulting ministry. And so doing quite a bit of that. And then, of course, some people know I'm an engine nerd. So I've been out in my shop working on lawnmowers like that by myself. I like alone time a lot. A lot of people don't realize how introverted I am. They think I'm an extrovert because I get up in front of people, but I do like alone time. And so that in some ways for us introverts, this is probably much easier than people like you who really are fueled by the presence of others. So for me, it's not as hard, I'm sure, as others find it.
Yeah. Well, I've got a tractor that might be coming your way in the next couple of weeks once we're released here. Any book in particular that you'd recommend that you're reading right now?
I've been reading a lot of old stuff, and you kind of know that. I always joke that I read stuff written by dead people. And, I continue with that. I'm reading some of the great old preachers. I would encourage people, devotionally. There's some of the old devotional stuff is just so rich and so wonderful. And it's not to say there hasn't been some good devotionals written in the last few years, but, Oswald Chambers is a standard go-to for me. My Utmost for His Highest. I read that virtually every day. Spurgeon's Morning and Evening is another good one. I bought some old books from Pastor Ernest Kennedy a while ago, and I've enjoyed those ones. I bought all the musty, dusty ones, and some wonderful stuff by F.F. Bruce. This morning I was reading some sermons by G. Campbell Morgan, one of the great preachers of yesterday. And so, but what I read might not be of interest to some others. But some of the classic devotional stuff is really rich and wonderful. And I would encourage people. And some of that you can find online. Practicing the Presence of God by Brother Lawrence. I think it's one of the most read books in the world after the Bible.
Wow.
And profoundly interesting book. He was a shoemaker, but he had this deep communion with God, and he was asked about it, and so he began to write on it and produced this little book called Practicing the Presence of God. Very, very rich little book, very helpful book.
All right. Yeah, you got me onto Chambers about a year or two ago, and I've really enjoyed that. It's been good.
Good.
For you people who, like me, also read people who are currently alive, I just finished The Ruthless Elimination of Hurry by John Mark Comer, who references a lot of dead people. So you might, like, if you had to wade into today's literature, that might be a place for you to land.
Sure.
All right, so getting into your sermon on Sunday, we were walking through the story of the resurrection of Lazarus, and we sort of left right before the miracle took place. That we sort of like hit pause and did the cliffhanger the week before, and then we walked right into the miracle this past week.
Right.
And you hit a couple of comments that I thought were really profound, and I'm just sort of going to repeat you back to you and ask you to expand on that, because I know you're, especially with the digital medium, you're a little bit more cramped for time. So you said, don't ask God to meet a need that you could meet yourself. And I was really struck by that. I was almost a little put on my heels and said, like, so how do you balance that with dependence on God and trusting him and letting him lead? For those who are pretty self-motivated and are going to go out and grab the bull by the horns, how do you tamp those people down and allow them to live a life of faith and balance that with expecting people to be active, but also patient and faithful?
Yeah, I think we should always do what we could do and expect God to do for us what we cannot do. And, I don't think that is an issue of not being dependent on God, but I also think we should not be presumptive on God, and there's certain things that, often, I've said to myself, I'll pray and say, Lord, help that family out financially. And when I'm done praying, I'm thinking, well, I could begin by doing something. Yeah. And maybe that's how the Lord would do it. So sometimes the Lord's working is actually through us. Now, the issue that I think tends to conflict with the dependence issue is who's going to get the glory. So the glory is always reflected back to God, but I think we have a role to play. And, and God works through men and women. We see it through the pages of the scriptures. We see it through church history, where God invites us to participate with him, including today in the proclamation of the gospel, the euangelion, the good news of Christ. And so, we should do our part and expect God to do his part. And I've always found him to be faithful. He's always held up his end of the bargain. So, I just think we're invited, we're told that we are to be his ambassadors and we're stewards of the message. And that's both in proclamation and demonstration of the holistic message of Christ.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So the hope there for you as a teacher is to encourage people who might be sort of sitting on their hands, praying and saying, God, would you do this? And not actively like engaging in whatever would move that forward, whether that's for themselves or for those around them. That sort of.
Yeah, sure. The example I gave was, if you've got, especially in what we're in today, we may find that somebody we know really has a financial need, and you could be praying, Lord, meet the financial need, and then you can say, well, I can get $50 worth of groceries or $25 in groceries and take them. Now, then the issue becomes what motivates that, and where does the credit go? And so use that to say to the person, hey, I just felt God wanted me to do this, I preached a sermon around Christmas where I was a reluctant participant in blessing a young woman who was a waitress, and I wanted people to understand that I was to receive no credit in that. It was the Lord's prompting, and it was just a bit unescapable. So we always want to reflect the glory back to God and the credit back to God, but he asks us to do our part.
Yeah. Yeah. And then another one of your lines that just really struck me was you talked about the sequence of words when Jesus is talking to, I believe it's Mary at that point. It says, like, if you believe, then you will see. And
glory of God.
Yeah. And it's not, what we would typically hold to in our world. When I see it, I'm going to believe it. That Jesus actually flips that on its head and says, when you believe, then you will see. I wondered if for people like me who are sort of like gobsmacked a little by that, are there any like examples of you could either whether it's in scripture again, or if it's in some real life, some examples of how that would work itself out, that you believe, and I know you well enough to know that this isn't a, name it and claim it sort of theology that you're trying to build up here, but to say, like, as we put our faith and trust and believe in what God says, then we will begin to see these things manifest.
Sure. Yeah. So in John chapter 8, Jesus says, I am the light of the world. Whoever follows me will not walk in darkness, but you'll see. And so the premise I was making there is, we as Christians believe that we receive the indwelling of the Holy Spirit, which is also the illumination of the Spirit. And so, when you do not have that, it's hard to understand that you do not have it, because you don't know that you do not have it. And so Jesus is saying, if you believe, then you will see the glory of God. And, there was a famous psychologist in the 60s called Abraham Maslow, and he had a famous line that most people know. They might not know the origins, but he said, when the only thing you have is a hammer, everything is a nail. Okay. and so the application there is, how you view things then is often determinative of how you approach things. And, that's a psychological reflection. But on a theological reflection, once you have the illumination of the Holy Spirit indwelling in you, then you should invite the Holy Spirit to consistently and persistently bring illumination to you so that you can see the things of the Lord. That's why the psalmist in Psalm 119, I think it's 18, says, "Open my eyes, Lord, so I may see wonderful things from your law." Yeah. So the psalmist is saying, God, you illuminate for me so that I will see that which you desire to see. The wonderful, I think some translations say your wonderful works, or your wonderful things in your word. And so, that the issue there is we're asking God to, as Christians, indwelt by the Spirit of God, we should be consistently saying, God, illuminate for me, reveal to me, because I believe I now have this capacity to see. And, the Pharisees, asked Jesus about blindness and that, a whole thing there. The reference has just gone out of my head, but that, and he says, those who think they see are going to actually realize they're blind. And the fact that you think you can see probably reveals that you're blind. And so it's just an interesting kind of world in which we live, where a lot of times people think they're so highly illuminated, but it's the Spirit's work in us, and then we can see things that we could never seen before. And I've seen that in the lives of people who come to Christ and they begin to grow, and they say, "Man, I used to not see the things." Each morning we have the choice. We can say, "Okay, Lord, let me see your glory today," and then you're out and you're walking down a path, and you see a brilliant cardinal, and you can say, "Well, there's the glory of God's creative handiwork," right? So, these are things that you may not notice prior to this experience with Christ.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I was even sort of in my brain as you're talking there, pairing the two conversations we were just having of like, that faithfully walking in obedience to God, doing the things that we can do and allowing him to do his things, and then seeing his goodness, right? Like I've, had friends and experienced in my life, those moments where you feel like you've got to step out faithfully, and you're like, I don't know how this is going to land, if this is all going to shake down, and then you see God's goodness on the other side of it, that it almost takes some obedience before you get to see God's hand faithfully like working, that it does take some level of faith.
Exactly. Yeah.
I thought you made a really good point about faith, that holding on to things that you accepted in reason when your feelings change. I love that it wasn't just saying like you need blind faith, but you need to not let your ever-changing emotions and the landscape that seems, for us in this moment right now, everything seems to change, and now it's more like every few days. It was for a while, seemed almost hourly, that things were sort of changing and news was coming out, and not allowing that to change what you accepted in reason. And I loved the pairing of like faith and reason there, because often those two things are pitted against one another. So you're one of the most like thoughtful and highly reasoned believers I've encountered with. So how do you get, so not just you, but for those of us who aren't at that academic level, how do we get a reasoned faith? And, with this extra window of time we have here, what are some things that we could do, that we could take in to allow our faith to have good, solid reason in this time? Sure.
Well, building off the premise that I made was, this whole idea that we need to not let the emotions of the moment just sort of derail us. And the world we're living in right now, you almost are afraid to click on CNN or CTV or whatever, because there's some new record and it's never anything good, right? So here's the thing. I'm going to say this as succinctly and thoughtfully as possible. And so if people are listening, this may be the best thing I say in this whole podcast today. Okay. And here it is. One of the really, really unhelpful things in our world today is this vociferous appetite we have to move forward and the latest and the newest. And let me unpack that a little bit, and then I'll put some practical handles on it, okay? The Old Testament, as we read the Old Testament, it's a theology of remembrance. All of the feasts and the festivals of the Jewish people, even to this day, are causes of remembrance. If you read the New Testament, and if you have a computer and you want to do this, it'd be an interesting thing to do. If you read the New Testament and you go on your computer and type in and look for every verse in the New Testament that has the word remember in it, you will find that in the Gospels, the word remember is almost exclusively on the lips of the disciples, who remembered something Jesus said, remembered something Jesus had done, and then they said, aha, that's what that now means to us today. Now, of course, one of the most beautiful uses of the word remembrance is the thief on the cross who says, remember me, Lord, when you come into your kingdom, right? Or when you come into paradise, right? So, but one of the things that's just, I think, spiritually killing us, Andrew, is this appetite we have for moving forward, the latest and greatest. And here's the deal. The faster we move forward, the less capacity we have to remember. Now the issue at hand is, what did God do on the first Sabbath, on the seventh day that he rested? I would make the argument he remembered. He remembered what he had just done, okay? And so what is part of our role in Sabbath is to remember what God has done, right? And because we live in a frenetic world that's moving forward and we're on to the latest, and we got to, why do people sit in restaurants on their smartphones? They got to get the latest text, the latest Instagram, the latest message, the latest news, everything. And we're racing forward at such a rate, we're losing the capacity to remember. And when you remember, you celebrate, you learn, you grow, you appreciate. And, I would imagine that if we were to ask, our parents or grandparents to reflect back, their capacity to remember is far superior than ours. Yeah. Now, they might not be able to do a Zoom meeting, And the reason why they've done that, Andrew, is because they've been told the stories. Mm-hmm. That's also why in the Old Testament it tells us to tell to the next generation the things of the Lord, right? When they're going out and when they're coming in, we're to remember that. So that's a long answer to say those are the things that lay for us a foundation of faith that's unshakable. And what should we be doing in this time? Let me give practical application. One of the things that we do not do well as followers of Jesus is we should be recording all of the times and places where God's worked in our lives and where we can remember him faithful. You know, a time where he met us in illness, a time where he met us in financial need, a time where he met us, you know, in our loneliness or sadness. And so we should be scribing those down, and we can go back and reflect on those. One of the things I've done that's been helpful to me in the time that I was a pastor was, you know, being a pastor sometimes, believe it or not, is not easy. And sometimes you have people that, you know, that think you're a dimwit, and probably at times I was a dimwit. So, you know, but at other times, you know, you can get really beat up, and that happens. And so, you know, I kept a file of cards and notes that people would write to me. And there was days where I had to get those notes and cards out and just reflect that, hey, I'm not just spinning my wheels, and God is using me, and God has proved faithful through my, you know, very flawed and faulty ministry. And so we should be doing that for our own faith strengthening, and we should be doing that for our kids and our families and the next generation. And that's what cements for you this reality that you can trust God and when we remember. And so, you know, that's probably the key word to all of this, is that we just don't remember enough. Yeah. And because we're launching on to the latest and greatest and the next thing. And, you know, that's driven largely by consumerism, right? You actually need to have a TV that's 4 inches bigger because life will be better with a 70-inch screen than a 66-inch screen, right? Yeah. So, you know, that's driven by that. But I would just exhort and just encourage parents and families during this downtime is just to sit and remember, get out a pile of paper and some masking tape and write on the paper all of the things you can remember as far back as you remember of the things God's done. Tape them all over the kitchen wall and put that up as raising your Ebenezer, right? As your time of remembrance of God's goodness. And we're going to need to remember those things. And these are the times you need to remember those things. And that's why God had the festivals for his people, to remember the faithfulness and the presence and the power that God brought into their lives over and over again. Yeah, that's so good. I love that. And you mentioned, you know, the generations before just have this uncanny ability to remember. My grandmother, any conversation you have with her, she will give you like the full name and address of every person involved in the story. There's no possible way I could recall those sorts of, and she's in her 70s, and she can just pull that up. It's unbelievable. But yeah, you're right. You know, and it's indicative probably because she lived in a time where her mind didn't get crowded out by noise, right? We live in a very noisy culture, and you know, we just need to sometimes push out some of the noise. You know, the more noise, the less able you are to hear. The less able you are to hear, the less able you are to remember. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and as we're talking about faith, you talked about in your sermon the contrast between the faith that Jesus had and the faith that, you know, people who knew Jesus and, you know, even said verses before, like, I believe that you can do this, but their faith always seemed to be on a little bit shaky legs. I think all of us are going to, if we line up our faith against the faith of the risen Lord, like obviously ours is going to look a little shakier. But you give some characteristics of the faith that Jesus had that really were helpful for me as a listener. Would you just sort of like give us a Cole's Notes, rewind on those too? Sure. Yeah. You know, I mentioned 3 things. You know, I think Jesus looked at them and they all had some, you know, right from faith that was, you know, fairly consistent with Mary and Martha, although kind of flawed, you know, like I would say consistent but incomplete, right, to some people that even after they saw the miracle, and we didn't get that far into the story, but even after they saw the miracle, some believed and others went and told the Pharisees and said, yeah, you know, this guy's going to be trouble, right? So, you know, there's the continuum of faith. So I said, Jesus looks at that and I think we see three things in his prayer that demonstrate a faith that works in the world. The first one is there's an intimacy in his faith. He addresses his Father as Father, right? And the beauty of that is we're invited into that same level of intimacy. And faith is ultimately taking God at his word, and that's an issue of trust. And you really cannot have deep and real trust in someone you don't know. And sometimes people do that, and they trust celebrities and sports figures. And, if you're looking at someone, from 500 miles away, everybody looks better 500 miles away.
Yeah.
And, and then we get all disappointed. Oh, this person, this celebrity, or this athlete, this person of some fame let us down. Well, of course, because we were never close enough to know that actually they had a lot of warts.
Yeah.
And, one of the things I realized when I was living in the U.S., especially in the South, is, you get around a lot of what I would call celebrity Christians, And so I would get exposed to, people that are sort of people of faith that are, have been very well known. And I won't mention names, but if I did, you would know a lot of those names. And sometimes I'd have dinner with one of those people or have a conversation or a coffee or an interaction. And I come to realize that God had gave them incredible influence and gifted them, but actually, you know what? They were flawed as well, right?
Yeah.
And so when you get close to people, but when you get close to Jesus, when you get close to God, he only looks better. He just looks better. And so we're invited to this very personal, intimate faith. And that's the only faith that's going to work in times like COVID-19, is where you have a deep intimacy, a deep communion with the Lord, right? And now let me just give a caveat to that, okay, which might be helpful. I realize there's people listening here that when they consider father figure, they immediately transpose that to an earthly father figure who's been hugely disappointing or hurtful or just a bad father figure. So I would encourage those people to sit down, if that's you, and that always gets in the way a little bit, sit down and write this on a piece of paper. This would be the perfect father. And then write down what you think the attributes of a perfect father would be. So that would be trustworthy, kind, fair, correcting, because a loving father would be a corrector, just doesn't let you free will, right? Patient, insightful, long-suffering, consistent, balanced. Write all those down, and then at the bottom, write this. This is my heavenly Father. He is the perfect Father, and just ground yourself in that. So the first thing is a faith that is personal. The second thing is a faith that is settled, and that's where Jesus says, Father, I know you've heard me already on this. I've talked to you about Lazarus. I know you all always hear me. And that goes back to what I said before, that, you have to have a faith that is reasonably decided, so that the scriptures say you're not blowing to and fro like, a sail in the wind. And so, again, that goes back to really remembering and cementing the consistency and reliability of God, that, every perfect gift comes down from the Father of lights who is above, in whom there is no shadow of turning. So there's no surprise side to God, right? Where he tells you one thing and then he's going to do something else. Yeah. So that's this faith that is settled. And then finally, and this may seem a little bit unusual to some people, but a faith that works is a public faith. And that's a little bit of a chicken and the egg. Does it work because it's a public faith, or because it's a public faith, does it work? I'm not sure. I think it's a bit of both. But, that when you begin to demonstrate your faith publicly, you'll get some pushback. But it's also a tremendously faith-strengthening reality. And so we're at a time right now where we can do that. We can live a public faith. And I think people are interested in that. So those are the three.
Yeah, I was really struck. Like for me personally, the thing that I've said, like COVID-19 is going to be a time where I really develop an intimacy with the Lord. And when I'm praying for people, that's the thing that I'm praying for. Because I think for a lot of people, pushing out the schedule and the demands and all that life is thrown at them so consistently, for many, like most of that's out the window, and they have this extended time need to learn how to be alone and intimate with the Lord. But I was a little not off put, but sort of like had a question mark over my head when you said a public faith. I'm like, how do we in quarantine live a public faith when we're not allowed to interact with more than 4 or 5 people at a time?
Sure. Well, I think we all have, relationships that sort of move in concentric circles in our lives. So inner circle is, our spouse, our children, our parents, and then there's the next circle, which is sort of our closest friends. And then the circles begin to move their way out. Well, go out about 3 circles and you're going to find sort of, peripheral people to your life. They're not peripheral people, they're peripheral to your life. But these are the people who you could phone up and they wouldn't be totally wigged out by that. Like, why in the heck is Andrew phoning me? I haven't heard from him in 30 years. Although there may be somebody in your life that you haven't spoke to for 10 years, but they're still not wigged out if you call them, right? Say like,
right.
And here's what I would suggest. Sit down and say, Lord, I want to know from you by your Spirit, guide me to those people who I'm to communicate with this week or in the next few days. And then just begin to write down some names, right? And then you can call them up and say, hey, hey, it's Steve, it's Andrew, or whatever. And they say, oh, okay. And just say, hey, I got all this time on my hands. I was thinking about you this morning, and I just wondered how you were doing. Like, how are things going? And I've made a few of those phone calls in the last few days, and people are greatly appreciative. And here's the thing, begin to listen between the lines for the fears and the pain and the unknowingness and those kinds of things. And sometimes, if you're on the phone for 5 minutes, and I always tell people, don't listen to what people necessarily tell you. How are you doing? Fine. Listen to what falls out of their mouths in the conversation, and then ask them this question. Before we get off the phone, I know this might not be your thing, but would you mind if I prayed for you right now? Because it sounds like, you're concerned about the finances or the kids at home, and that's tough. You're trying to work. And then you just pray for them on the phone. And you will find that is a very meaningful kind of a way. And that's what Jesus did there with Lazarus. He prayed in front of all those people, and he didn't ask them, but he invited them into that conversation with God. And that's what we can do. We can invite them into our conversation with God. And in that, you can include that God will bless them or reveal himself to them, encourage them. And then if you feel that was a meaningful conversation, like some people are just going to say, well, thanks very much, talk to you again in 5 years. But if it's meaningful, then say, hey, you know what? Like, sounds like we're going to be locked out here for a while into our own houses. Do you mind if I give you a shout in a week? Just find out how you're doing. And, and again, you just have to listen for the Spirit's prompting in that, and then be sure you phone them back in a week. Like, don't just blow smoke and then not do it. But so these, that's just a very practical thing. And, there's something wonderful and warm about the sound of a voice as opposed to a text or an email.
Yeah.
And especially at times like this, what's funny is, in my mind, is we've worked so hard to digitize communication. And what I'm sensing now is people are longing to talk.
Yeah.
I phoned somebody today just to encourage them, and, thought it would be a very brief conversation. And I was on the phone for like 15 minutes. And that was great. That was great. I thought, man, this is great. This person just wanted to talk. Mm-hmm. So, we can do that really easily. Or you can do it like we're doing, face to face on the internet. But I think it's the face to face, not the typed.
Yeah.
It's the voice, right?
I would agree with that. It's just like trying to work through some ministry stuff here over the past couple of weeks. The desire for human interaction is higher than I have ever seen. For sure. And I think we've got an opportunity here to connect with people and show Christ's love in a very new way, but in one that isn't surprising ultimately, because he's wired that into our hearts. Yeah.
Well, one of the interesting statistics is in Waterloo region, the Kitchener-Waterloo, I hope I have this right, the Kitchener-Waterloo Community Foundation, I think that's right, every 2 years does a sociological report called Vital Signs.
Mm-hmm.
And it's all the statistics on how people are doing relationally, sociologically, not how business is doing or commerce or anything like that, but it's how are people doing. And the last 2 or 3 times that report's come out, in the top 3 always, as far as need goes, interestingly, is community.
Yeah.
Which is interesting to me because we like, we hear, the vernacular is we've never been more connected. We're a connected culture. Well, we're a digitized culture, but people have this longing for community and to belong and be connected. And I think here's an opportunity we have to make people feel like they're part of something bigger than maybe they are currently.
Mm-hmm. I love that. All right, I'm going to speed us along here. I just wanted to land on this one point, and then we'll make our exit here. Okay. You talked about when Lazarus comes out, and there's this moment that I've breezed past a number of times in Scripture where you talk about, Jesus says, "Go unbind him." That Lazarus walks out, and it's funny to picture like he's sort of stumbling out there, head wrapped, and trying to get out of his burial cloth, and Jesus says, "Go unbind him, that he may be free." And you talked about the spiritual work of those who are believers now to step in and to help people get free. And for me, it felt like scales fell from my eyes in that moment. I'm like, yes, that's why when people are saying like, "Hey, I believe Jesus and I'm trying to follow him," but they're still bound. It just was like how did you miss this, Andrew, moment when you were preaching? And I got to listen to your message 3 times, so it hit me multiple times. But for those who are, currently wrapped up still, how do they get unbound? And then what are some practical things that we as believers who would say we're set free at this point, or at least, we're a little less tangled up? How do we help other people get free?
Sure. Well, let me begin this with saying this. Here's a little backstory that's just kind of interesting, maybe. Here's a wonderful picture that I didn't have time to expand on Sunday, but this is just literally a week or so before Christ goes through the same experience.
Mm-hmm.
And it's interesting when Jesus comes out of the grave cloths are folded up neatly in a pile.
Yeah.
He's not bound by any earthly things. He shows his divinity. We are. We need to keep that in mind.
Mm-hmm.
We think, well, Christ, resurrected Christ and everything. Interestingly, to some extent, though, Christ's body bears the scars of his time on earth, because remember, he shows Thomas his nail-pierced hands.
Mm-hmm.
So we do get dinged on earth, right? We get dinged on earth, and out comes Lazarus, and I think he's probably kind of stumbling around. I don't think he's wrapped up like a mummy, but he is kind of stumbling around. And I just think it's a picture of, then all of these other people are invited in to help him get unwrapped. So, what does that look like today? I think we, as fellow followers of Jesus, when people have a resurrection experience with Christ, we're raised to walk in newness of life, but we don't become completely new. And we still are a product of who we are. We're not a prisoner to that. When the disciples go out in the closing of the book of John, and I've been out on the Sea of Galilee 6 times and looked over at the Church of St. Peter there on the spot on the beach where Jesus has the charcoal fire.
Yeah.
Gregarious Peter still jumps over the side of the boat, and swims in. So he's still this sort of, sort of unstoppable kind of guy, sort of, acting and then maybe thinking a little bit behind, but that's okay. But that's a picture of we're not completely freed from exactly who we are. Now, the thing we're talking about, I think, is, sometimes there's destructive things that we are a prisoner of that we shouldn't be a prisoner of, but we may be a product of eventually. And so I think that what we should do as followers of Jesus to help others is 2 things. One, we should be sensitive and winsomely remove objections to moving forward. So when they have things in their life that they just articulate and speak about, we should remove those objections, like, well, why can't you do this? And so I think that's one thing. I think the other thing is we should clarify misconceptions to the Christian life and what the Christian life looks like. And there's a dissonance or an incongruence in the Christian life to be a Christian and then be overwhelmingly bitter towards people, to carry generational anger, to live in ways that are personally destructive, and so those are removing some of these things that people are a little bit blind to. So just challenging people on notions that just are not correct in a very way that's winsome, and in a way that's helpful, and a way that's done within the context of relationship, right? Because people need to feel safe before you're going to start, speaking in.
Yeah, we talked about that a few weeks ago here, I think.
Yeah. The other thing that I would really encourage people to do, and this is maybe a little bit of a pet peeve of me, is to use extreme caution as to what you post on social media as a Christian. We as Christians sometimes get into debates on social media about other Christians. And we take Christian articles and we extract them from their home, which is within a Christian context on a Christian website. And we extract that article, then we drop it into Facebook or into social media. And then a bunch of Christians begin to debate about which Christians are right and who's wrong and everything. Yeah. And like for me, I have hundreds of friends on social media who are not followers of Jesus. And the last thing I want to do is to have them be observers in a debate about, which Christians are right and who's out to lunch and everything. We can have some of those internal discussions amongst ourselves, but let's be really careful about contributing to other people being bound up in maybe previous hurt and pain, and being able to say, yeah, that's exactly what my experience with Christians in the church was. They're always dinging each other. Yeah. And so I just think we just need to be very, very cautious in those areas, and not get into those kind of discussions that really are meaningless theologically and destructive potentially emotionally and relationally to people who don't really understand the dynamics at play.
That's the shadow side of being willing to live a public faith, right? That if you do something dumb or say something hurtful, people see it and experience it. Right?
Here's the difference. Here's the difference in one sentence. Living a public faith is talking about Jesus, not other Christians.
Yeah, that's a good point. Well, with that nugget of wisdom, I think we'll wrap up here. Thank you, Steve, for taking the time here on a Tuesday with us. You're not up this week?
No.
Is that correct? All right. So we won't see you next week. But for those of you who are faithful listeners, we will see you then next Tuesday as this drops again. Again, if you're connecting in with our messages on Sunday and you have some questions for us, we'd love to get those at forwardchurch.ca/ask us, and then we can interact with those here. They shape our conversations each and every week. So we're thankful to you, Steve, for joining us, and for you guys for listening. We will see you again next week.